Their legends embody the spirit of the Old West, where rough justice was dispensed at the business end of a Colt 45. They captivated an expanding nation hungry for its own mythology of good and evil. They were heroes chasing villains, the white hats against the black hats, and they went down in a blaze of glory. They lived, they fought, and they died in the dusty towns that stretch out on the landscape of the American past. I'm Bill Boggs on the trail of the great Gunfighters, a trail worth following for every historic traveler. The first stop on our journey will be Tombstone, Arizona, site of the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. From there, we ride to the picturesque mining town of Bisbee, where a simple robbery blew up into a fierce Old West shootout that would become known as the Bisbee Massacre. And we'll finish with a trip to the scene of the Lincoln County War, where the world first heard the name Billy the Kid. Tombstone, Arizona. Not much has changed here since its first days as a mining town. The landscape is still dry and sparse, and the historic legends are still rich and colorful. The stroll through town is a step back into the 1880s in the frontier American West. Shops, saloons, and trading posts line the raised boardwalks. To start, you can set yourself up at the Silver Nugget Bed and Breakfast and head right across historic Allen Street to your first stop, the Birdcage Theater. Local historian Ben Trewick says the Birdcage is the only building in town preserved in its original state.
Well, the Birdcage is the most originally preserved building in all of Tombstone. We had two big fires here, one in 1881, one in 1882, and the majority of all the buildings on the street were burned down, just leaving the shells. So they had to be refurbished and renovated to bring them back to their original state. But this one's just like it was. When the mines flooded in '86, people started moving away, and all the other businesses boarded themselves up. So did the Birdcage. It was closed up for almost 50 years, and then they opened in the 1930s to let visitors see what it was like inside.
In the Birdcage's heyday, the New York Times called it the wildest, wickedest night spot between Basin Street and the Barbary Coast. It offered burlesque shows, can-can dancers, and nationally known vaudeville acts. A house full of cowboys meant that things sometimes got out of hand. You can still see there were more than 140 bullet holes in the walls and ceiling.
The Birdcage derived its name from these suspended cribs you see about us, where the working girls plied their trade. At the same time, Tin Pan Alley had a song that was catching on called "She Was Only a Bird in a Gilded Cage." And because people saw the girls flitting from one crib to the other, it became the Birdcage. Well, right at this table, they had the longest running poker game in the world. It lasted 8.5 years. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 8.5 years.
That's a game. Trewick says the Birdcage played a part in the growing feud between the Earps and the Clantons that would finally burst into history as a gunfight at the OK Corral.
Well, legend tells us that Wyatt met Josephine Marcus here. And at the time he met her, she was Johnny Behan's mistress, living with him. And he took her away from him. So this little love triangle between Josie Marcus, John Behan, and Wyatt Earp caused much of the friction between the cowboy gang and the Earps.
Trewick and his gang recreate the famous shootout on the first and third Sundays of each month. Visitors are invited to watch the gang of outlaws, known as the Cowboys, meet their fate at the hands of Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, and their friend John Doc Holliday.
You men have been looking for a fight, now by God you can have it.
Don't shoot me, Wyatt, I don't want to fight.
We came down here to arrest you boys. Now throw down your arms. Hold, I didn't mean that.
Fighter, get out!
Well, it's called the gunfight at the OK Corral, but it actually didn't happen there, did it?
No, it happened in this lot right where we're standing, adjacent to the OK Corral. Now, we do our gunfight in the other lot, which is the real OK Corral, because we call it the gunfight at OK Corral. It would not do for us to advertise our gunfight as the gunfight in the adjacent lot behind the OK Corral.
Well, then who actually started the gunfight?
Well, Doc Holliday instigated the fight. He was living in that room where the window is, in Fly's boarding house. And Ike Clanton had talked to the other cowboys into coming down here to kill Doc Holliday. They were certainly surprised when they looked up the street and saw Doc coming home with the Earp brothers along. So they were beginning to waver in their decision to kill Holliday and were about ready to surrender their guns. Well, Holliday knew if they did and walked out of this lot that he was a dead man, because they'd shoot him from the dark or they would catch him when the Earps weren't around and shoot him. So he instigated the fight by punching Frank McClower with that shotgun and saying, "We're going to kill you, SOBs." And they believed him. And Frank drew his gun. And that's when Wyatt Earp shot him.
Billy Clanton and Frank and Tom McClowery were laid out in new Sunday suits under a sign reading, "Murdered in the streets of Tombstone," and carried to the cemetery in 2 wagons. One of the town's hearses is now on display at the birdcage. Known as the Black Mariah, it still carries its original 24-karat gold and sterling silver trim. The Mariah's last stop is also a fitting place for you to end your tour of Tombstone. It's Boot Hill Cemetery, so named because most of its residents died with their boots on. Buried here are some of those killed in the feud leading to the famous gunfight, as well as a few lesser knowns with some rather colorful headstones. Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a .44, no less, no more. And of course, no trip would be complete without a chance to pay your respects to the losers of the gunfight at the OK Corral. 25 miles south of Tombstone sits a town not half so famous, but just as wild in its heyday. Bisbee, Arizona today is a quaint hamlet nestled in the heart of the Mule Mountains. It is rich in ambiance with historic streets and striking Victorian architecture built into the hills. Bisbee's claim to fame, though, in the annals of frontier crime began with a street shootout that came to be known as the Bisbee Massacre. On the evening of December 8, 1883, 5 masked robbers rode up to the general store that stood on this spot. Their target, the payroll safe inside. Fireman James Krigbaum heard there was a robbery underway, strapped on his 6-shooter and hustled down Main Street. When Krigbaum opened fire, the robbers started shooting back at anything that moved.
Drop those bags! Hold it!
By the time it was over, 5 citizens were dead, and the outlaws had escaped with just $600 and a gold watch. It took months, but a Bisbee posse eventually captured all the robbers, plus a local dance hall owner who masterminded the holdup named John Heath. The robbers were sentenced to hang, but Heath got off with life in prison. The townsfolk were none too pleased, and 3 days later they strung Heath up from a telegraph pole, a classic case of frontier justice. With the rule of law reestablished, citizens could return to business, which in Bisbee's case meant copper mining. The main diggings in town were here at the Copper Queen Mine, which now offers 5 underground tours a day. If this winding maze of shafts were straightened out, they'd run from here to Flagstaff, nearly 300 miles. Almost a quarter of the nation's copper supply was extracted from Arizona at one time. Much of that from Bisbee. Gold, silver, lead, and zinc were also mined here, with the total take over the years of about $2 billion. Nowadays, the mining operation is shut down, but visitors can still get a feel for the cool, dark, dangerous job the miners did. Tour guides demonstrate the drill used to bore dynamite holes and show off the shafts used to transport ore out of the pits for extraction. After the tour, you may be ready to follow the path well trod by those long-ago miners to famous Brewery Gulch, once the heart of Bisbee's red light district. Where Brewery Avenue and OK Street were once lined with saloons, dance halls, brothels, and gambling joints, now you'll find quaint restaurants, galleries, and still a few saloons. Some things never change. For years, the bars and bordellos of Brewery Gulch earned Bisbee's reputation as a wild and woolly western town. By the turn of the century, the city fathers are working hard to brush up the town's image and attract families. They passed laws confining Bisbee's brothels here to the upper reaches of Brewery Gulch. In 1914, state prohibition finally closed the last of the bars. And although western towns like Bisbee struggled to gain respectability, you could still find a good old-fashioned shootout a couple of miles outside of town. We now head out of Bisbee to the site of one of the last great gun battles of the Old West. It took place near a town called Klondike in the Galliuro Mountains of eastern Arizona. A Jeep tour organized by High Desert Convoys of Tucson takes travelers into the hills in World War II era vehicles, through Arizona's fertile desert where rattlesnakes, antelope, and the spirit of infamous outlaws still roam. It's a great drive through some rugged terrain and a way to cover a lot of ground. The destination, this old rough-hewn cabin where the Powers family shot it out with the deputies at the time when the Old West gave way to the new. Tour guide Joe Capanier says Jeff Powers and his sons John and Tom were ranching cattle here when deputies arrived in February of 1918.
Well, it all started at dawn one morning. Four sheriff deputies from a town not far from here came out to serve warrants on the brothers for draft dodging. The father, Jeff, heard some noise outside in the morning, early in the morning, and he heard voices.
Hands up! Get your hands up!
The older brother, John, ran to see what was wrong with his father and retreated to the room to get his weapons. John never saw out of his left eye again. Quite amazing, his younger brother, Tom, went by the window and it shattered, and he never saw out of his left eye either. But they did manage to get one shot off, and the gun battle was over with.
3 of the 4 deputies had been killed, along with Jeff Power, and the Power brothers had been transformed from ranchers to outlaws in one blazing moment. Tom and John Power and their ranch hand, Tom Sisson, headed for the Mexican border. Within hours, they were being chased by a posse that eventually grew to 1,400 civilians and soldiers, the largest manhunt in Arizona history. 5 weeks later, exhausted and starving, Tom and John Powers surrendered to the U.S. Army just south of the border. They were tried and convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But Joe Capanier believes the whole thing was a setup.
I believe that the sheriffs came here actually to set the Power brothers up and claim that they were bringing warrants for draft dodgers. And the literature that I've had and read, they were basically coming here to steal a gold mine from the Powers family.
Tom and John Powers served 42 years in the state pen, 2 of the longest imprisonments in Arizona history. Then in the late 50s, a newspaper columnist took up their cause and the Power brothers were finally paroled, both nearly 70 years old. The Powers cabin has been preserved as a historic site. High Desert Convoy's Jeep tour to the cabin takes about 6 hours round trip and includes a boxed lunch. They offer other tours of historic areas in southern Arizona as well, including a visit to an Indian petroglyph site and a mining ghost town. We continue hunting down the famous gunfighters of the Old West with a run across the state line into New Mexico to the scene of Billy the Kid's legendary Lincoln County War. Now, and for most of its existence, tiny Lincoln, New Mexico has been nothing much more than a quiet ranching town. But for a few years, in the late 1870s, Lincoln was the epicenter of one of the bloodiest chapters in the history of the American frontier. Most of the places that served as the battleground for the infamous Billy the Kid and his men are still here, preserved together as the Lincoln State Monument and Historic District. A walking tour with Chief Ranger Jack Rigney puts you right in the middle of that violent episode.
Well, John Henry Tunstall was an Englishman who decided to enlarge his family fortune by investing in Lincoln, and he did so by building this great store you see here. This didn't set well with the Englishmen up the road, Dolan and Murphy, and of course they had Sheriff Brady and other officials in their pocket also.
Jack, tell me about these windows.
Very interesting feature on this building. The shutters on the windows are steel lined, and we can assume from that Mr. Tunstall was either trying to protect his property or he was expecting big trouble. As it turned out, big trouble.
With a good selection and good prices, Tunstall started cutting into the business at Murphy & Dolan's own general store. So in true frontier tradition, Dolan arranged to have a sheriff's posse assassinate Tunstall. That might have been the end of it, except that one of Tunstall's loyal employees was a young hothead named Billy Bonney, known to all his friends as the Kid. Billy and his friends quickly organized themselves into a group called the Regulators and swore to avenge Tunstall's murder. On April Fool's Day, 1878, the golden moment of vengeance arrived.
Now, the Kid and some Regulators were at the Tunstall store, and they knew full well that Sheriff Brady would be walking past the alleyway here. They stationed themselves right here, and as Sheriff Brady and his deputy walked by, they opened fire. Boom! Let them both have it. Both were killed. In the ensuing battle, the Kid was wounded in the leg and went into the Tunstall store.
That night, after the excitement died down, Billy slipped out of town, but he'd be back. The Lincoln County Heritage Trust Museum tells the story of the escalating violence in the county following the April Fool's ambush, as men on both sides were blasted and bushwhacked till hostilities finally reached a climax in mid-July. On display is the gun Billy used in a climactic shootout on Lincoln's Main Street that came to be known as the 5 Days Battle.
Billy and the Regulators were here in town to protect Tunstall's partner, McSween. Murphy Dolan boys were held up in this defensive tower. The Kid and the Regulators exchanged gunfire periodically, sporadically through town until they were finally forced into McSween's big house, the adobe house. McSween and 4 others were gunned down as they left the building. The Kid made it okay, but for all practical purposes, it was the end of the war, the end of the Regulators as well.
And still, Billy the Kid couldn't stay away from Lincoln. At one point, he made a deal with Governor Lew Wallace to testify against one of Dolan's men in exchange for a pardon. The governor put Billy up here, at the home of a local politico named Juan Patron. Billy was treated like a hotel guest. Good food, good cigars, a nightly poker game. If you bring your own cigars and a pack of cards, you can enjoy the same experience. The Casa de Patron is now a charming bed and breakfast furnished with antiques and collectibles from the era. And you won't have to check out the way Billy did either. After he realized the governor wasn't going to come through with his pardon, he slipped his unusually small hands through his shackles and walked out the door. By this point, Billy seems to have lost whatever youthful idealism he had. A horseback ride courtesy of Cowboy Trail Rides will take you over the hills where Billy and his gang took up cattle rustling. After a year and a half as a cow thief and gambler, Billy was finally captured by Pat Garrett, tried for the murder of Sheriff Brady, convicted, and sentenced to hang. And for the hanging, the state brought Billy right back to Lincoln, where it all started. By this time, Dolan's store had been turned into the county courthouse where Billy was held to await his punishment. The building still stands, and you're invited to come upstairs and inspect the hasps where Billy was shackled. After his escape from the Casa de Patron, the 2 deputies guarding him were taking no chances. But this bullet hole is proof that the Kid's time had not yet come. On a trip to the outhouse, Billy somehow got his hands on a revolver and shot one guard, leaving this memento. The other guard abandoned his dinner at the Wortley Hotel across the street and looked up through the second-story window of the courthouse. Billy aimed the man's own shotgun through the window and gave him both barrels. When Billy saddled up and rode out of Lincoln, it was the last time he would ever visit Lincoln, dead or alive. Visiting gunfighter sites from Tombstone to Lincoln fills 4 or 5 days. Add another day or 2 and you have time to catch some of the desert wonders along the trail. 2 hours east of Tombstone is a Chiricahua National Monument, home to the tribes of Geronimo and Cochise. It offers Apache history, scenic drives, and a visit to Faraway Ranch, the oldest dude ranch in the Southwest. After his daring escape, Billy the Kid would live just 10 weeks until Sheriff Garrett finally gunned him down in nearby Fort Sumner. But during his 21 fiery years of life, he created a legend that grips us to this day. It's the myth of the gunfighter, the champion of his cause, the master of his own destiny. Hero or villain, the gunfighter's unblinking fearlessness is irresistible. I'm Bill Boggs. Thanks for joining us on Historic Traveler.